Hello, and welcome to the fourth week of the Atlantic slave trade and abolition module. So, last week we were looking at the macro level changes that were happening to 18th century colonial empires and the transition from the first Atlantic system into the second one. This week we're going to go and look at the smaller journeys that took place along the triangular trade route, looking at the specifics of the different stops of each leg of that journey. So let's just refresh what those three legs are. The triangular trade route is a horribly oversimplified model, if I'm honest, but it is a useful tool when studying the slave trade. The first leg takes place traditionally from Europe to West Africa, where valuable goods such as arms, weapons, and different precious metals are traded with local African leaders for their population or populations of different regions that they have taken. The second leg traditionally has been portrayed as from West Africa across the Atlantic to Central and South America. And this is known as the Middle Passage. And there has been a lot of research on this stage, which I'll outline now and in the seminar. And then finally, the final stage of the triangular trade route is where ships have taken the goods that are being grown in the Caribbean and taken back to Europe. So, what I'm going to do today is give an example of each stage of this journey. And what I want to try and do and give you an idea of is these are just one example of each stage, and there are hundreds of each. And hopefully, that will demonstrate to you guys that it is much more complex than this oversimplified model demonstrates. So we're not actually going to begin in a port town where you might expect. We're going to begin a lot closer to where we are. We're going to start in Birmingham. And this is really where the beginnings of the triangular trade route take place and other industrial centres like Birmingham. In the 18th century, Birmingham is known as the workshop of the world, slightly hyperbolically known as having 1,000 different trades. And it is during the 18th century, when Britain starts to dominate the slave trade, that these industrial centres begin to develop and expand at a rapid rate, much faster rate than urbanisation has previously taken place. And Birmingham's population increases almost 80% over the 18th century. And it becomes known for industrialists who work with metal. One of the most famous, who is Matthew Boulton, who invents the steam engine, which revolutionizes the way that mass goods are produced. You also have individuals like Samuel Garbett, who is a chemist who works with changing the percentages of the elements in metal. And a really interesting example, and one I'm going to bring up more in the seminar, is a Quaker industrialist known as Samuel Galton Jr. And Quakers are, in theory, pacifists. They promote peaceful approaches to life. But Samuel Galton Jr. is in the business of producing guns, which he sells in the slave trade, as well as shackles for the slave trade, which makes him a very controversial figure. But these men are primarily creating objects that are to be sold throughout the transatlantic world rather than simply just within Britain or Europe. And Birmingham in particular, although there are many industrial centres that form throughout Europe, especially in central Germany, Birmingham in particular gets known for its fine work with metal goods and the flexibility of the workforce who can create elaborate metal pieces. And in particular, one metal is important, and that is brass, because brass is used in making guns. It is also used to make brass manillas, which you can see on the bottom of your screen, those ringed objects. And manillas are produced in hundreds of thousands per year and is used as currency for slaves. And the reason that they are so popular with English merchants is that it is relatively cheap to produce these brass manillas. They're just made up of cheap copper and tin from the mines of Cornwall and Swansea. And then they're very cheap to produce. And then they sell them for enormous prices because brass is known as red gold in Northwest Africa. And it is coveted for its decorative purposes. And you see a lot of Birmingham brass used in the tribes of Africa. And if you see on the right of your screen, that is a brass decorative ornament that was purchased by someone in Nigeria. So this is where the triangular trade route begins, in the industrial centres that are forming in the 18th century. And these products are moved in enormous numbers to the port towns throughout the Atlantic world, ready to be transported. And the example I'm going to give to you today is Liverpool, which is one of the most extraordinary expansions we see in cities in England. But again, these port towns exist throughout Europe. And Liverpool gets known in this time period as the second city of the British Empire because of the extraordinary amount of goods that are being exported out of the city. By 1799, 40% of the world's slave economy is going through Liverpool alone. 80% of Britain's slave economy is transported through Liverpool. Now, when I say slave economy, I'm not just talking about slaves. I'm talking about objects that are related to the slave trade as well, like the brass manillas of Birmingham, which are transported north to Liverpool. Although I will also say enormous amounts of slaves actually come into Liverpool and leave Liverpool. So it's not as simple as just goods leaving. Slaves also arrive. And there are over 4,000 slave ships that leave Liverpool in the 18th century. And this creates, I've spoke about this a little bit before, a new class that is forming in England and throughout Europe of people who are making money from this trade. One of the most famous sons of Liverpool is an individual called William Bulkeley, who began as a whaler, but moves into tobacco exports. And also, after he makes money through tobacco, begins privateering expeditions to raid Spanish and Portuguese ships. So this new middle class of aspiring businessmen form in these systems. And we can see how frantic the trade was through the newspapers of the 18th century. If you look at the bottom right hand of the screen is a newspaper from Liverpool, and you see variety of slave ships advertising when they're going to leave and space on them for people to put their goods, as well as actual slaves being sold. So when these enormous amounts of ships with goods and services leave Liverpool, traditionally they head to the northwest coast and along the slave coast of Africa, although they also go to various other parts throughout the Atlantic world as well. The example that I'm going to give to you today is an island off the coast of modern day Senegal, which is called Gorée. And these islands are very popular with European slave traders in particular. Having an island off the main coast makes it defendable. It gives a lot of autonomy to Europeans, which is why these islands are purchased by Britain, France, and Portugal. And traditionally, it also allows them to take these ships that have come from Liverpool and the Mediterranean ports, and you can unload the goods there rather than on the African coast, where they might be slightly more vulnerable. So private companies like the Royal African Slave Company would purchase an island or a settlement on the coast, and that's where the ships would come in and unload. And they would often have armed escorts to ensure people like the man I just mentioned from Liverpool couldn't send a privateer mission and steal the goods from it. Now, before I go on to the exchange of slaves, I need to explore a very important stage of the slave trade, which is slave missions. And these were not traditionally conducted by white Europeans. One of the major reasons for this is because of the death rates of Europeans who went on these missions. It's estimated that about 80% of white Europeans who engaged in these slave missions died. And that's for a variety of reasons. They're extremely dangerous. One, because often local African leaders are going into other territories to find slaves and meet resistance. So there is violence. But also, in terms of disease, malaria is incredibly you have an incredibly high death rate in Europeans who catch malaria. So traditionally, the African leaders would organize expeditions of African soldiers to go along a river into Central Africa and find people to capture for the slave trade. And the example that I've given on here is Galinas River, which kind of borders Liberia, Sierra Leone, and Guinea. And it made a very useful kind of inroad because you could go into other people's territories easily and steal their people. By 1800, 2,000 slaves per year are transported out of the Galena River on its own. So as you can imagine, adding the numbers up for all the different rivers along the West Coast is a staggering number. But it's a very dangerous part of the triangular trade route, and there are numerous rebellions and revolts fought, many of which we don't know about because of the lack of written sources about them from African tribes. But we do know of a very notable example of the Lomboko fortress, which was destroyed by slaves who had been captured by local leaders in Sierra Leone. And that inspired the film Amistad, which was made by Steven Spielberg, which I'd recommend looking at. Although not completely accurate, it gives an insight into some of these issues we were talking about. And at the top, we have something that is top right of the image. You have something called a slave barracoon, which is where the African leaders would put their captured slaves, punish them, brand them, before returning them to the African coast to sell on. And the term barracoon is where the slur for African people, which is coon, it comes from. So it derives from being a captured African. These slaves are then taken from inland along the rivers back to slave markets for the exchange with the Europeans who have offloaded, usually on small island ports. And an example that I'm going to give to you today, well, there are hundreds, is the interesting example of Zanzibar. Now, the reason I picked this example is because it's actually on the east coast of Africa. We focused a lot on the west coast, but Zanzibar is an island just off the coast of Tanzania, which makes it interesting because it is accessible to Europeans via South African ports, as well as Middle Eastern people who can access it from the east. So you had east and western markets purchasing from Zanzibar, which created some of the highest numbers. And the Zanzibarian slave market is one of the most famous examples. It began usually selling men. The bigger, the stronger the man, the higher the price they would get, because you want physically fit people to work in the plantations. But in Zanzibar especially, Europeans and people from the Middle East began to become interested in the beautiful women of this region in particular. So wives were purchased at a high rate here as well as children to take to the Caribbean and um, create a sustainable population. The conditions of the Zanzibar market were horrendous. Very little room, cramped conditions, hundreds of people in small accommodation. So disease and feeding the amount of slaves became difficult as well. You wanted to make sure they were fed and physically fit, but you also, as a slave owner, didn't want to spend much money. So it was a difficult place. But this is where the exchange of slaves for the goods and services brought from Europe would take place. And there are literally hundreds of these along both the west and east coast. Now I want to explore the physical transport of the slaves, the ship itself. And this is one of the most famous images that show what a slave ship might have been like. Slave owners wanted to keep as many slaves on as possible. So this shows how they were lying next to each other. You wanted to utilize your ship space as much as possible. And often their legs and arms would be overlapped as they lay down. And what this image doesn't really capture is that there would be multiple levels below deck. So there would only be a foot or two above the face of a slave that is lying down. So you could get multiple levels of slaves. So the conditions were horrendous. And we've spoken about the difficulties of how to calculate the rate of death on these missions, but we believe it to be at least between 50 and 30% of slaves who got on a slave ship never made it over the Atlantic. But that is also the same for the people who were employed to run the ships. People didn't want to take part in these journeys because there were so many slave revolts and the conditions were awful, the food was cheap, and storms would still kill people. These missions across the Atlantic could take from anywhere from 6 weeks to 6 months. So they were long, arduous, cramped conditions. And one of the best images we have of what it was like on the ships comes from a German painter called Johann Moritz Rugendas. And he was actually on one of these ships and created this image. So we can see the chains around their ankles, the cramped conditions. Many of them were naked, which is degrading and shows how little respect they were given. Often in this journey, it was much colder than they were expecting as well. People were left to go to the bathroom where they lay. So it stank. It was full of disease, and people were often seasick. So these conditions, as you can imagine, were horrendous. I've listed a lot of different famous slave ships below, and I'm going to ask you all to have a look at one or two of them to just talk about in the seminar. So we'll be asking you about specific ships and some of the difficulties you find when looking at those. Now, the example I'm going to talk about of when the slaves that actually survived the mission across the Atlantic, the actual plantations that were created. And this is something we spoke about last week because I think it's probably one of the most fascinating and abhorrent examples of a plantation. So this is St. Lucie on Barbados. And as we've discussed before, Barbados was really the first slave society. And if you go there now, you can still see the remnants of the colonial buildings that were built there. And what is interesting is that there wasn't really a population before Europeans moved Africans there. So the original population of Barbados was probably made up of West Africans transported by Portuguese and the French. But also what they were harvesting there wasn't a native plant either. The sugarcane that was produced there was actually imported from Brazil by the Dutch. So you have people who weren't born there harvesting plants that weren't initially grown there either. So it's this fascinating and terrible example of how slavery became an actual society in these Caribbean islands. And it's easy to think of most slaves working in the fields, but that's not necessarily true. Lots of the men would, but outside of that, there were a variety of logistical things that needed to be conducted by slaves as well. So, growing animals and food to keep the slave population fed. So many became agricultural farmers for the other slaves. You also have a decent number of white slave owners, about 15,000 by 1700, and they would have servants, and many became who worked well in the fields when they got older and less productive became house slaves, which actually became a position that many slaves aspired to because it was much easier than working in the hot fields. So St. Lucie becomes this divided society of houses for slaves, houses for slave owners, and various different roles as well. An interesting factor of St. Lucie as well is you get lots of persecuted Irish slaves as well. So you have an interesting mixture of religiously persecuted individuals and racially transported individuals as well. And I mentioned in the seminar last week about the slave mask. So I've included that picture there. And as you can imagine, wearing that in these conditions would be unbearable. And there was an enormously high percentage of people who were worked to death in Barbados. But of course, Jamaica and the other islands had very similar conditions as well. So the sugarcane that was originally found in Brazil and transported to the Caribbean to be harvested by West Africans traditionally were then taken to a multitude of markets throughout the Mediterranean and North America and the rest of the Atlantic world. The example that I'm using today is Trieste, which is a northeastern Italian port town that really expanded during the 18th century. It had been a port in the medieval period, but because of the goods coming from the Atlantic slave trade, it expanded enormously. And lots of people from inland Europe and different parts of Europe began moving to these coastal towns to take part in this blossoming economy and make themselves a fortune. In Trieste, in particular, you have huge number of Serbian traders move to northeast Italy, and you get this interesting clash of cultures between Eastern Europeans, Africans, and traditional native Italians. So migration changes in Europe as well as people want to move to these markets and they expand and become wealthier. And if you look at the bottom right, you can see the remnants of colonial architecture and the money that is still in these places built on the foundation of the slave trade. And Trieste, whilst lesser known, actually for a long time became a greater economic powerhouse, even compared to Venice. And then once the trades have been made in these port towns, rich people's lives are increasingly transformed. It's not just the monarchy who were rich, as was the case in medieval Europe, but you get these wealthy landed gentry investing in palace building. And one of the most extraordinary palaces I want to draw your attention to is in Calais in Portugal, which was built by Peter III, who began to be known as Peter the Builder because of the money that was coming into Portugal from the slave trade. You have this huge infrastructure rebuild, transforming European towns and cities, and these luxurious palaces where the rich who've made money from the slave trade go. And this is actually one of the first summer retreats that was ever created. And it was built using gold discovered in Brazil. And you can see it has a Renaissance style architecture and inflections and inspirations. And this is only possible because of the money that's generated in the slave trade. And luxury goods are imported from Liverpool and from the Caribbean and North Africa to fill these palaces. And I've got the interior on the bottom right, and you can see the gold and the portraits that they have commissioned of themselves to celebrate their wealth, as well as dining plates. And really importantly, if you can see, teacups, tea, drinking sugar, drinking the sugar imported from the Caribbean becomes a luxury pastime. And to think that so much of what is happening is there to create a luxurious lifestyle for the rich, and rum becomes popular drink in the Mediterranean as well. So hopefully what this demonstrates is that the triangular trade route is overly simplified, and for each stage of the journey that I've outlined, there are dozens, if not hundreds more examples to study, and the trade routes are complicated and intricate. But as a result of the slave trade, the entire Atlantic is transformed. These port towns and industrial centers expand. People move from rural areas where they traditionally lived in the medieval period, and urban centers become the places where people live. And that is defined modern civilization and how we live today. So for the seminar, I want you to read Paul Lovejoy's The Impact of the Atlantic Slave Trade on Africa. And that's a review of the literature, which is really important, all the different ideas about this. And that's from the Journal of African History, volume 30, number 3, pages 365 to 394. And it's really important you read that. I want you to think about what the impact of the slave trade was on Europe, on Africa, and the Caribbean, because we're going to be comparing and contrasting the similarities and differences seen. I'd like you to look at one of the slave ships in more detail, so I've already mentioned that. But I'd also like you to come up with a different example of one of the stages of the triangular route. So I came up with Birmingham as one of the industrial centers. So maybe you look at an industrial center in Germany. I looked at a port in Senegal. You could look at a port from Lagos in Nigeria or somewhere else. Just come up with another example so we can look at the differences that existed. And then finally, I've put some primary sources on Moodle, and I'll be discussing them in the seminar. So you might want to, have a look at those before the seminar. And I look forward to speaking to you then.